So now we dive in a little deeper with utilitarianism. As we already saw from the textbook aspect, we know that John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham both were considered sort of the grandfathers of utilitarianism. Both had some slight variations on the way they thought about this, but really at the end of the day, they believed that pleasure and pain govern our lives, that the goal is that we want to maximize happiness, the greatest good for the greatest number of people. If you're a Star Trek fan, which I am, right? You know you've met Mr. Spock or Vulcans that believe in the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the needs of the one. And in that same scenario, he's a very logical, rational utilitarian. He believes that everything comes down to a basic mathematical formula. We do what it is the best because it's going to have the greatest positive impact on people, even if there's harm that comes to some people at one way or the other. But the goal here is that we should all have the opportunity to pursue our own happiness and to do so as long as we don't deprive others of theirs or impede their efforts to obtain it. So as long as I'm not impeding your way, even if something has a negative impact, I am not necessarily directly impeding your way to your happiness. Sometimes I may end up in a situation where I go, oops, here it is. This is the problem that we're facing, and I am going to be impacted by this. But I didn't necessarily intentionally or purposefully stand in your way from achieving your happiness. But the goal really is, it's like a mathematical formula, very much similar to what you've already learned about in the textbook, where we want the greatest good for the greatest number of people. When we think about the ethical lens assignment, which you're going to be doing in a couple weeks, this aligns with what we call the results lens. And that results lens is about looking at how our actions, what our impact our actions have on outcomes. So utilitarianism is outcome focused, not necessarily intention focused. It's focused on what the outcome is and making sure that no matter what happens in terms of what we do, as long as the outcome is good, that's really what matters the most. Now, of course, there are strengths and weaknesses to that, which we'll get into in a few minutes. So the decision rule for utilitarianism, as we already are familiar with, is we need to do what produces the greatest good for the greatest number of people. The goal is to minimize harms. And again, we want to maximize pleasure, minimize pain for the largest number of people. The interesting thing here is basically all the stakeholders are equally weighted. No stakeholder is more or less important than another. They're all equally as important. So when we think about our impact, yes, we sometimes may weight shareholders a little bit more. We weight, though, individuals, and individuals are what matter the most. Your autonomy, making sure that you have the ability to do what makes you happy and to maximize that, whatever it is. And now there are times we're going to be on the short end of the stick. That's kind of the way majority rule works. Sometimes the greatest good for the maximum number of people is great, and you might be in the minority. Those are the kinds of things that happen. But utilitarianism is generally one of those tools that we use often to rationalize a lot of business decisions, and that becomes the only one that we use. Think about some of the downsides or the dark side of saying all that matters is the outcome. How we do it doesn't matter, right? All that matters is the consequence, the outcome. And if it produces good, then yay. But the challenge is, what if we do something that's illegal, unethical, immoral? We hurt somebody. And we do that stepping over somebody. We hurt a good group of people. For example, the Ford Pinto, a great example of that, and I know we've already talked about that. The Ford Pinto, right? That's a great example of utilitarianism. And what we really want to focus on is how do we balance the pros of this, which is it's a great tool because it's easy to understand, but also take into account that it can lead us astray when we're only thinking about the outcomes. Often we can do things that might be wrong in order to get that positive outcome. So we want to make sure we're mindful of that. So we see this often in business studies when we do cost-benefit analyses. What are the pros? What are the cons? We want to maximize the pros, minimize the cons. When we do an environmental impact study, we weight all the factors and we decide what impact matters more or less than another. When we vote, majority rules, right? That's also another example of how utilitarianism works, and it's part of our democracy, right? The majority wins, whether it's even in the electoral college or whether it's in the popular vote. Although those aren't always in alignment, but generally speaking, they are. There's only been a handful of times where they have not been in alignment. Tax laws are also about what is good for the greatest number of people, those sorts of things. So our goal is always maximizing good, minimizing harm, whatever that is. So let's move on to those strengths. As I said, the important strength of utilitarianism is that the stakeholders are equally weighted, that it's liberal, not in a political liberal sense, but it's liberal in it means that no one's happiness is more important than another's. It's open. It values everybody in that sense. It is a really easy way to describe how most people make decisions. We go by majority rule. We go by what maximizes what makes me happy and minimizes what makes me unhappy. It's a pretty easy theory to understand. It makes perfect common sense. And it really forces us to really think about the outcomes of our decisions. It's not enough to just say, I had the right intention when I went into it. It's also about I had the right intention and I didn't have any negative impact, because it's the impact of our decisions that can really harm people. There are some clear weaknesses to utilitarianism, and basically those come from the fact that we sometimes overestimate costs or the pain, and we underestimate the benefits. And so that forces us to then avoid making risky decisions. We become kind of gun shy from making those decisions because we've overestimated what the negative impact would be. So that's our goal, is to figure out how we can be more focused on the pleasure side of things. And the other thing that's a big issue, and this is relevant if you're in the minority, right? The majority is not always right. So who's going to protect the minority? Who protects them? And of course, if you've ever watched Casablanca, right, that famous line that says the problem of three little people don't amount to a hill of beans in this crazy world. And the whole point of it was there's three of us. We're being negatively impacted. The world is going on around us, and we're being negatively impacted by this, and there's not much we can do about it. And that's a very frustrating place to be when you're in the minority. Like when your political party wins, you're excited. When it loses, you're not so happy. When the law that we wanted passes, great, or the company policy that is in place is great, and it's good for me, but it's not good for my neighbor. These are things that become challenging for us. And in a democracy, we have to recognize that there's ebbs and flows and pluses and minuses and changes that are going to happen fairly regularly. And then this last quote by Peter Singer, I think, kind of tries to get at it as well. No conclusion about what we ought to do can be validly drawn from a description of what most people in our society think we ought to do. Just because the majority wants to do something doesn't mean it's always right or moral or ethical. Right? We all at one point thought it was okay to own people. The majority of people in our country thought it was okay to own people, to use them as slaves, and or to enslave them, and to make them do work and to punish them if they didn't do what we wanted them to do. People thought that was an okay thing to do, and it is not. So we have to be very mindful that just because the majority likes something doesn't mean it's always right. Additional weaknesses that we should be aware of is sometimes it's really easy for us to say, just make it quantitative and that solves the problem. And what we lose when we boil everything down to a quantitative number is nuance. We lose the nuances and some of the qualitative data that we can collect when we understand things are not on or off, right or wrong, left or right, up or down, that there's a continuum of actions that can happen in between, that there's more subtleties about that's in between those two extremes that we need to be taking into account. And so things aren't easily boiled down to, well, the majority wants this, so therefore we should do this. That is a true weakness of this theory. And lastly, this notion of what is good, right? What's good for me is not good for you. And so even if we all agree we want to maximize the greatest good for the greatest number, we see huge debates about what people think should or shouldn't happen because something is or isn't good. So being aware of these pros and cons is a really important part of understanding and applying utilitarianism. It's an important theory, like all the other theories that we're going to learn about. It has its pros and cons, just like each of the other theories have as well. So it is important for us to keep in mind that each theory in and of themselves cannot stand alone, that we should use them in conjunction with other theories. All four of them, or all five of them, as we think about it, should be applied. We should think about the impact of all five of those theories and then move forward from there in terms of what we think is the best option given all five of those perspectives. So practicing those perspectives is the most important issue that we can face.